Happy Labor Day weekend. Happy first day of college football. And happy last time that I'll be talking about Love Island US Season 7. We're going to be celebrating all three of these things on this episode of Positively Uncensored, which reminds me, welcome back to Positively Uncensored, your favorite reality TV and interview podcast. It's your host, Leah, and I'm so excited to put Love Island behind me, respectfully so. It's been an exhausting season. It's been a toxic season. At times, it's been a fulfilling season. But at this point, content has felt daunting with Love Island. And with all of my content, that's really the last thing that I want. When I don't enjoy talking about it, you don't enjoy talking about it. And the fact that Love Island commentary is taking up so much space in my brain just feels contradictory to having enough space to focus on the things that I actually have to do in life. So I'm putting it behind me. Unless Andy Cohen and Louis, Huda's alleged boyfriend, get into a fist fight or an argument and watch what happens live, unless Nick and Landria have exciting news to talk about, unless something blows up, I'm not going to be talking about this season. And as I let this season go, I wanted to let it go by bringing some of my very complicated and nuanced thoughts to the floor. I thought that that would be a good way to wrap the season. If you are following my TikTok, first of all, thank you for following me on all platforms, Positively Uncensored. It's the same on Instagram, TikTok, all across the board. But if you're following me on TikTok, then you know that I talked about Chris's episode on a podcast called Truth After Dark that Paul Pierce, former NBA basketball player, is on. He may also be a media personality. I'm just a little unfamiliar with him, as well as the host of the show, Azar, whom, quite frankly, I'm also unfamiliar with. He went on this podcast episode and there was very few segments of the podcast that was worth $8. In fact, none of it was worth $8. If you're like, I didn't see that Chris went on a podcast, I haven't really seen anybody talking about that. That's because the podcast was behind an $8 paywall on Patreon, and to each their own. I get it. But I also think the podcast may be put behind a paywall because a lot of it was problematic. And I'm talking 80%. Now, after I get into a little bit of the thoughts of the podcast, what I want to talk about in terms of my complicated thoughts. Chris, we knew prior to the season, if you went and looked at his social media, was allegedly following and posting support of Tory Lanez. I think he posted free Tory Lanez at some point, and anybody who supported Tory Lanez over Meg the Stallion tells me everything I really need to know about the rest of their personality. Nonetheless, that exists separately with the fact that what we saw happen to Chris on Love Island in his coupling with Huda, with the acknowledgement of production, with what was allowed to go on between the two of them, toxicity wise, how Huda has handled things after the fact. All of that is inappropriate and it should have been delved into more. I find it extremely disappointing that both on this podcast, Truth After Dark, as well as on the reunion, no settings have given Chris the space, to my knowledge. Correct me in the comments. I just haven't seen this. I haven't seen Chris had the opportunity to talk about what happened in the bedroom after the pillow fight when Huda kept poking him, and we find out that she was asking for it every single night. There was even a moment on Truth After Dark where he talked about the fact that despite them not showing it, she was asking for it from him every single night. So that happening and being glossed over, as well as her general way that she treated him, which was very much like, I'll have sex with you, but I don't want to give you any public attention. All of that just felt very problematic. It felt like it enforces problematic stereotypes. And it felt like Huda was not held accountable for how that situation played out. So again, my feelings are complicated because on one hand, the things that Chris says are problematic. He's a problematic individual. He says a lot of things that echo sentiments of misogynoir. Simultaneously, what happened to Chris on the show was horrible and adds to why I think that reality TV shows are dangerous for Black people in general, Black women especially. But let's just talk about Chris on Truth After Dark for just a couple of minutes, because, like I said, this is my last episode talking about Love Island. So, because I'm going to get flagged if I show videos of the podcast, what I'm going to do instead is just tell you the main points, starting with very early on in the podcast. Chris talks about the fact, and mind you, the hosts bring all of this up, right? The hosts set the tone for the conversation. But Paul Pierce and the hostess, they both agree that Shelley wanted you. And if Chris wanted Shelley, he could have her. Now, in case you decide to pull up the podcast, it's timestamp 3 minutes and 59 seconds in. But the host says it gave you could have had her if you wanted her. And Chris agreed with that. And the host really felt like Ace was insecure when Shelley came back with Chris, and that Chris, being 6'8", thinking that he's superior to other men, saw the fact that he would have to compete with Shelley over somebody else. And he says himself, I wasn't going to do that when I have another shorty over here who's willing to be into just me. And in that segment of the podcast, it's clear that he was talking about Huda. I think it's delusional for Chris to think that Shelley wanted him or was going to choose him over Ace. I think that if anybody was feeling insecure, it was Chris. The fact that he allegedly could have been playing basketball the whole time instead of on the show. He could have been playing basketball overseas. I think that he was upset by the fact that he wanted Shelley. Everybody wanted Shelley. And she was more interested in a guy who's 5'8", 5'6", 5'7 and a half, right? I think that was very humbling and took a toll on Chris's ego. And I would have been interested to hear them make space in their podcast episode for that conversation. Like, how did it feel to have Shelley choose Ace over you? Like, you just talked about how the hostess asked at one point, do both of you, Paul Pierce and Chris, feel superior for your height? They answer yes. So then in turn, how does it feel after you're feeling superior, feeling like the prize, and then you're not chosen? Because I would just be curious to see how Chris's answer would have gone with that. There's one part of the podcast that comes in around 7.5 minutes, and the hostess, Azar, talks about how Huda being the most popular person on the season is exactly what is wrong with society, and Chris agrees. There was a very trigger warning for both misogynoir, said like, I don't know how to word this, of alluded to DV and just problematic segments in general, okay? But as they're talking about that, I don't have it written down, but I believe it was Azar who said this. And she said, and I have in quotes, because when a man hits you upside the head, you're not stronger than a man. You won't beat him at his own game. Stop while you're ahead. As much as I think that the way that Huda talks to men and women is despicable, as much as I think that we really should treat others with respect to get that respect back, I thought that that was a really gross thing to say. Implying to essentially know your place. I just wasn't sure to what extent they're saying that, but it feels like it's also setting the tone for it to be okay for a man to respond to a woman defending herself, popping off, calling him a name with hitting her. And it's not. That's absolutely not okay, right? Like, because of your size, because of your strength, because of your privilege to be a man in the relationship, it should be a responsibility to walk away, to make space, to de-escalate, right? You're the person who holds both the ability to escalate a situation past what your partner can, and then you hold the responsibility to de-escalate a situation. But that's not the last time that they talk about things that in my mind are harmful. Again, there are some points that I agree with, though. The next segment that they get into is taught in not more than a minute later, is talking about Huda twisting Chris's words, where she implied that he was bragging about having sex with her. And in reality, he told Brian, and in like a very humble way and in a very respectful way. All he said, I think, was that he folded. He certainly didn't walk around and be like, yeah, we finally fucked. Like, I have the baddest bitch. Like, she's so hot. But this is the segment where he said, I was asked every night. Again, Chris just says, like, problematic things, though. Like, he's like, she didn't lie, though. I did just give her the tip, though. Not that that's a problematic segment, but just the way he talks is just very interesting. I'll leave it at that. Okay. They move on to talk about the heart rate challenge. And Chris says that Huda had licked everybody's genitalia. It wasn't just Ace that got licked from gooch to tip, it was everybody's genitalia. He also goes on to say that he saw all of the footage between Jeremiah and Huda. They bring him an iPad every day for him to watch the footage before he went in at Casa. And after watching the footage, I have in quotes, I know that that's not her. Yeah, I know that that's not her. With the type of man I am, I could change that. So Chris really thought that he could go in there, was more of a man than Jeremiah, and would get a different response from Huda. He didn't think that that was a testament to Huda's personality. He didn't think that that was anything that he should be aware of. He simply thought that things would go differently for him because he's a different type of man than Jeremiah. And that, my friends, is delusional. And that, my friends, is delusional. And also, like I said, I don't know how, but like toxic masculinity, you know what I mean? Like Jeremiah, yes, he could have spoken up for himself more. And yet, simultaneously, even for the kind things that he did for Huda, he still got criticized on. Then Chris had to admit a couple moments later that actually then I found out no, I actually couldn't. And it's like, yeah, because you're not able to change that in somebody else. In the next conversation, we learned that Chris's desire after the show is to get into acting, get into modeling. He talks about some of his inspirations being Will Smith, Eddie Murphy, Leonardo DiCaprio, Matthew McConaughey. And I thought it was interesting that Chris does not aspire any longer, at least not publicly, to get back into playing basketball. I don't know if they stopped calling. I don't know if like people were suggesting, maybe they never were, right? Like maybe that never was an option for season 7. Around 19 minutes is where the episode starts to get really problematic. And a lot of this is started by Paul Pierce, the host. And he gets on a tangent, a side tangent, after he talks about Chris playing basketball overseas. And his hostess says, we had a viral clip where Paul said that he thinks that Black men in America should follow in French Montana's footsteps and get a girl overseas. And he asked Chris to speak to his experience on this. And Chris basically says that when he was overseas, he was dating an American girl. So he doesn't really have his own personal experience as to what a girlfriend is like overseas, but he did watch his teammates have girlfriends, and they were treated like kings. They would come home, and the host, Paul, and Chris bonded inappropriately, disgustingly over just how but like the girls don't argue with them and they never have problems with any of their behavior. And when they walk in the door, they immediately get lubed up and oiled up and they have dinner waiting on them, and just really romanticizing this passport bro mentality, or the idea that there's something wrong with American women. But then they get to the host's real point in a second, implying that something is wrong with Black American women. And Chris agrees with him on the point that girls overseas, their values are different, their morals are different, and they do cater more than American women. Now, Azar, the woman who is the hostess of the podcast, she does chime in eventually in this conversation around 30 minutes, which I'll get to in a moment. But she does chime in this moment as well and says, that's not true. Some American women are wanting to cater to you. They will cater for their men. And I just felt like this was such a sad, feeble, stupid conversation, because why do you deserve to be catered to? Why? Why does she have to cater to you? Okay, why can't you cater to your wife? Like I just felt like this whole segment was just really gross. Chris ends up saying that they really take care of you. They make sure that life is easy, not trying to argue, thankful to have someone like him. Like, okay, so you like the appeal of being with somebody because they make your life easier. They give you less responsibilities and then you give them more. It's just very gross. It's just very gross. And there's so much extra layers of nuance to dive in there, both with the position that somebody would be in this relationship where they don't have the upper hand financially. There's like there's misbalanced, there's inappropriate balances of power dynamics in the relationship as well. Like, this isn't even addressing any of that. They continue on, though, to talk about how when they go over to Melbourne and when they're in Spain, that they feel exotic. Okay. This is when they also say that they feel more exotic because they are 6'8". Chris laughed at Azar dating a man who is 5'10", which again would have been a great time to ask him, then how do you feel not being selected over a man who stands at 5'8"? Okay. More misogynistic conversations. Chris says that he probably wouldn't marry a 42-year-old woman because he would like to have children. Paul Pierce adds in, nah, they're cooked. It's just back to back to back to back. And because I paid the $8, because I listened to this, and because, I don't know, this adds some context to the season, we're going to talk about it. At 30 minutes, this is when the conversation gets very triggering, okay? Because Chris is outright asked if he's ever dated a woman outside of his race because he's played basketball overseas. And he starts to say yes, of course. And somehow Paul Pierce interjects while he's talking and says, listen to him, to Azar. He prefers that. And at this point, like immediately at this point in the conversation, like I just knew where we were heading. Okay. So Paul asks Chris if he thinks that white women are more appreciative. When Chris says, than who? Azar chimes in because she's heard Paul say this before, and she says, then Black women. And Paul says, no, 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 that's not what I said. Don't get anybody started on me. I said, then all of the other races of women. And Chris did respond at first and said that that's a hot take. But then he did agree with them. Like, then ultimately, he did agree with them. And that's where I'm saying this podcast is just paying for red pill content and to listen to two men sit and yap about misogynoir. Now, there was a moment where, as they're talking about if white women are more appreciative than Black women, which is just a disgusting sentiment, and no, Azar chimes in and calls them out and says that white women are also most likely to say that they're victims, say that they were raped, call the police, turn on you, and that black women are the most loyal, which turns into a side argument between the hosts. And it's just like there's just so many levels of this podcast to which I want to acknowledge the fact that I'm listening to a black podcast talking about things that are issues with inside black culture, and I am a white woman just watching. But this just felt very uncomfortable to listen to. And I hate the fact that people are using their platforms to circulate or punch down on Black women. And I just find it very uncomfortable to listen to, much less to have to pay to listen to when you think you're going to hear things that would shed some light on, like, the Love Island experience. They do say once that Shelly had the best aura out of everyone. Chris says that everybody counted on her. This was probably one of the nicest moments of the podcast. Let's see. Chris got advice from Paul Pierce towards the end of the episode, which naturally was don't trust these females. They never go anywhere. They always circle back. I I don't know who would circle back. I don't know who would circle back. The only good advice he gives him is to get a routine and don't get caught up in Hollywood. Don't get caught up in drinking. Okay? The end of the episode, which is the last 10-12 minutes, ends up turning into a role play where Chris shows off the skills of his acting, or alleged acting skills that he would like to use. He'd like Tyler Perry to call him. And him and Azar are doing improv together. She says that she's also an actress. They go back and forth trying to decide a couple of scenes that they could land on. And one of the first options that Azar presents is she wants to act out that she's pregnant and Chris does not want her to keep the baby and is trying to convince her to get rid of the baby. Chris is like, I don't really want to act that out. So they sit in silence for a few moments before Chris suggests that Azar has a terminal disease and he's her husband and telling him about it. I will say I called each one of my girlfriends, showed them this part of the episode, and in a way, I want to make it very clear I am not mocking cancer. Members of my family have had cancer. I am not mocking cancer. Okay, cancer is never funny. The way that Chris tried to act like a grieving husband in this scene was funny. I called each of my girlfriends without context to show them this and see their thoughts. And each and every one of us thought that both Chris and the host did a horrible job of acting out their parts. I would give the performance overall about a 4 out of 10 because their butts were in the seat. However, Chris's attitude, he's finding out his wife is terminal, and his first thought is, what are you going to do? What am I going to do? We're in this, the two of us. And then he goes on to say, you can, like, the kids need you. Because she goes, I just want to spend the last couple months of my life having fun and, going to Disney, being like a kid. And he was like, but the kids need you. We can extend your time. Basically, he's like, you better fight this. You better fight this because I don't want to do it alone. It was very cringe. It was very weird. They have one comment on the Patreon, and that one comment says, I feel like I just wasted $8. Why is there a cancer segment at the end of the show? It's like it would, like, I would say go look for yourself, but save your money. So my first thought, Chris's experience with Huda, how she treated him, sexualized him, what she got away with as far as trying to pressure him into sex every night, that never being addressed, that was gross. That was gross. The things that come out of Chris's mouth, even going back to him making the women in his family apologize to Huda, two things can be true. On to my next thing that can be true. Austin did several podcasts. He went on Nick Veal's podcast. He also went on another podcast whose name I cannot recall to talk about his opioid addiction. And on the topic of Austin, I'd like to say I don't like Austin. In fact, I've been very vocal about not liking Austin all season. I think it's disgusting that Austin was able to snake his way through the sneezing, and not get called out, not get cut. Meanwhile, what you're saying and the things that you were reposting politically were really gross. And I said that he's a dangerous person to have there around people of color, around Black people. And then Austin, like existing alongside of that, all of those things are still true. Austin is still MAGA. He's still problematic. He still has the potential to be harmful, has wound up being one of the most outspoken cast members about his relationship with Elandria, how much she was there for him in the villa, how kind of a person she is, how much he loves Elandria, and talked her up more than a lot of the other cast members. My brain doesn't really have the space to formulate more thoughts around that, but all I'll say is this. I appreciate the fact that Austin has been respectful of Elandria and said kind things about Elandria, because I, don't need one more reason to whack him. Okay, let's move on to Ace's interview with Speedy. Again, if you don't follow me on TikTok, you should follow me on TikTok, because that's where I give my first reaction to things and my sometimes brief thoughts. I want to start by saying this. I listened to the full episode and I listened to it multiple times, and I went back and forth with friends so that we could talk about things together. And I really thought about my feelings. And I think that I want to preface with this. I think that there are some major truths to take away from Ace's episode. Simultaneously, I think that the sections where he talks about Nick and Elandria were both irresponsible and unkind. Both of those have to exist with my commentary. Like, I can't have one without the other. If you're newer to my content, my podcast has been around for 4 years now, and a running theme throughout my podcast, and something that I always like to point out, is the production side of things. What could be happening with production? How could production be manipulating a story? Pointing out times that production manipulates a story so that they try to push a racist narrative towards Black women. How does production manipulate a story to try to protect somebody who they've deemed a fan favorite? How does production manipulate a story or footage to hide things that they've done that they would be liable for? And just really listening to the sinister side of production. And because that's something that's always interested me, but I've also thought was important when we talk about reality TV to keep in mind, because as much as one person's story can be different than another, it proves that there is a range of experiences to happen on the show. And just because everybody doesn't have the same experience doesn't mean that when we hear of sinister experiences, that those aren't true. We also don't really understand, unless you're in law and specifically familiar with reality TV contracts, you're really not familiar to what they're signing. And unless you've ever been on reality TV, which even I have not myself, you're not familiar with what it feels like to have your lodging, your food, your safety, everything that your communication to the outside world, every part of what you rely on be the same people who are producing you and relying on you to make good TV. And I just think that all of that is important not just for Ace, not just for this interview, not to just give him a pass and say, wow, he was put in an impossible situation, but to give grace to everybody else who was on that same exact island, to give grace to, we don't know what Shelly and Alandria experienced this season. We don't know what Nick's real experience was with this season. We don't really know anything. And most importantly, well, I think most importantly, I give criticisms and I give thoughtful commentary, which usually has a lot of nuance to it. But in my content, because I'm a white woman, you won't see me punching down on or giving other white people who are inclined to be racist permission to be hypercritical of the same Black people that they've been hypercritical of all season, with the scrutiny and litany of racism that was embedded in this season. I don't want my content to feel like a safe space for people to start saying racist things or saying things again enforced by racist stereotypes. And you're going to hear me talk about that again when I talk about why I'm not going to scrutinize Shelly and Alandria's friendship, because there's multiple reasons, but I'm not going to scrutinize it, but I will notice several things and I'll give space to other people to share their feelings in my comments. But there are certain things in conversations that I don't want to do with my content. Getting into the episode, we learn in the beginning of the episode that Ace is not his real name, but it's his chosen name, and it's very sentimental to him. Some people agree with this and some people disagree with this. Ace says that he believes that his intention was different than the others on the cast because he already started off with the following. As much as I see points that could be true, I also could see that this is still a marketing opportunity for you to further your portfolio and further how much people know of you. It would be remiss to think that because you don't have 800,000 followers, that you don't have a team who's always scouting opportunities for you that could be good for yourself, both personally, right? Finding Shelly, finding somebody, finding a lifelong partner, potentially, but also putting your name out there and then potentially being able to do what Cordell did, for example, and then tiptoe your way into the acting space, right? And as we move along with Love Island, though, Ace is certainly not the only one. I think on this season, there were lots of people who have portfolios or who have experience on the camera or who have been in certain situations that give them context to say, hey, you should apply for this show, or hey, this would look good for the end goal that you have. It's just packaged up differently for every single person. Ace continues on by talking about his mental health after the reunion. And he talks about how being at the reunion, he was feeling some depression, some anxiety coming out of the villa. And he talked about how his only fear going in was that he wasn't edited to look like he was evil. And when Speedy asked him, do you think that that's the edit that you got? His answer was yes. And I think that a lot of people are going to have mixed feelings on this. But I think it's important to remember that this is Ace's experience that he's referring to. And none of us know the full context of what was going on in that villa. They certainly did position him to look like he was the ringleader, the only person with a thought. And we know that that's not it. The only person with a personality. And some people will say, did Ace position himself that way Listen, we have to acknowledge the fact that every single person on that cast was cast because of their personality and cast for a reason. The same reasons that they cast Ace for, they used against him, right? Like they used him and his fun personality, his spontaneity, his ability to just think of group activities to their benefit while simultaneously using him in other situations. And if that's what he's saying, that his experiences, I don't think that I'm inclined to just say, no, it's not. Right. I also think that it's important for men to talk about their mental health. I think it's important for Black men to talk about their mental health. And I think, again, at the beginning of this podcast, just had a lot of things that were worthwhile for him to talk about and important to say. It's just unfortunate that every, let's say every for every 10 conversations that are positive, there's two that aren't, right? And he's 22 years old, right? He's going to grow, but we're just acknowledging. Ace talks about when he met Shelly, and he said that they met outside the club, got her number, flirted online, liked each other's pictures from 2 years ago, but they were in different places, so they never tried to make things happen more so than online. And here's where I say again, some people are pulling up this moment and they're saying, see, look, he's a scammer. And to that, I just say, I don't care because everybody is. Hood and Chris shouldn't have been in that final. Amaya and Brian weren't a real couple. I think Iris and TJ were playing the long game, which I said the entire time. Iris and Pepe shouldn't have been in that final. Even if, which we'll get to in a few minutes, Nick and Alandria were a fake couple. I don't care. I don't care. Get your bag. Be happy. Just have fun with each other and see what this is. I truly don't care. Like I don't care what any of them did. I never cared if Shelly and Ace applied together on the phone on FaceTime. I don't care now, but that's because I also don't care if Nick and Alandria do it. And there were at least two other couples who in my mind are scammers who got to the finale. Not scammers, but what are you doing at the finale? Like Chris and Huda didn't even try to fake it. They were just brought to the finale because this season was a disaster. But Brian and Amaya, they tried. Iris and Pepe, they tried. Continuing along. Ace talks about, and again, this was another important conversation. He talked about how him and Amaya had conversations where they talked about their boundaries. They talked about past traumas. They talked about why it was so important between the two of them to set ground rules. And they would edit moments where Amaya was emotional as they were opening up to one another, which Ace said also takes him a long time. They were editing moments where she was emotional and crying to come after moments where they were arguing and making it look like Ace had got this huge response out of her, and that just wasn't accurate. Again, as people are coming and saying more things about their experiences with Amaya, I believe this. I believe this. I also think that that's very disgusting. And the editors clearly did that to reinforce some sort of narrative about Ace. Like people can dislike Ace, people can like Ace, but we could at least just be neutral enough to say they clipped that for a reason, and it's to reinforce a problematic narrative about Ace or imply something about his character. Continuing on. I talked about Austin and I talked about how he respects Alandria. In that same breath, I want to talk about how I think he was picking at Ace the entire time. I think that he was poking at Ace. Ace talks about how Austin said snide comments to him, like would pick at him, like, how do you feel with this guy coming back? He's 6'8". And I think that when we spent a few moments during the season talking about how Austin, this tall white guy, felt I don't even know what word to use, but felt some type of way about Ace. I believe that. I don't believe that Austin's values exist completely in a vacuum. I don't believe that. And I'm so thankful that he was a good friend to Elandria, and that exists separately than the fact that I do believe, especially since he was competing with Ace for Shelley, and he saw that Shelley was more interested in Ace than him. I think that that played at Austin's ego, what he thought about himself and being desirable. And I think he just had a lot of microaggressions where, like I said, he tried to poke at Ace. Ace talks about how Sierra said that if there was somebody there who would be there for clout, it would be Ace. And he thought that that was rich coming from her, especially because it seemed like everything that she had to say was rehearsed. He basically said, Nick was dating her, not me. So I can't tell him not to, but I felt like everything she said was rehearsed. He then goes on to talk about how Huda said in a challenge that Ace, when they said who here is waiting for someone else other than their partner to come in, that Huda named him. And he said, respectfully, I don't even want to say her name, and I don't blame him. I don't blame him. He also talks about how they never showed us the slick comments that Huda would make at Ace, like after him and Amaya had been arguing all day. Remember, again, too, this is after the fact that Amaya's supposed to be Huda's best friend. She comes over to Ace, knowing that they've been arguing all day, and says, Ace, give me a fist bump. Give me a hug. I know you don't like to be touched. And as he says in this interview, you know that that would add nothing positive to what's going on between me and Amaya. So why are you saying that? I feel like there was just a lot of snide comments directed at Ace while he was in there, whether it was because of his height or otherwise. He also says that even Austin got mad at Huda for twisting his words to Shelley. And this was another important moment because this just solidifies that Huda was jelly of Shelley the entire time. She was locked in on her. She tried to sabotage her connection with Ace. She was locked in on her connection with Chris. It's just very weird how she moved with Shelley. It's very weird how she moved with Elandria as well. It's very weird how she moved with both of them, right? Ace also implies at some point in the interview, just in case I don't have a note at it, that there are certain people who have felt one way about somebody before the end of the show. And then after getting out and seeing the following that they have or the ship that they have, that now they're friends. And I can't help but think that this is immediately about Huda and Amaya. At this point, Ace starts to talk about Elandria and how he understands every single point that Elandria made in the villa and that he was in a very difficult position. When he was asked if Taylor let Elandria on, Ace is reluctant to answer this question, chooses his words very cautiously, and eventually answers that Taylor faced a lot of influences to be in that situation since day one. He also says, I always found myself helping Taylor. And when Speedy asks, did Elandria know about the outside influences influencing Taylor? He said, unfortunately, she did not, and I could not tell her, which put me in a difficult position. And I just think that there's so many layers to this being sinister. I think even introducing the fact that production had instructed Taylor to do this, it is just so diabolical and disgusting and problematic for so many reasons. First of all, you're letting Elandria become attached to Taylor and grow fondness for him while she's in the dark on what's happening. Second of all, it's taking away three people's choice. If we're to take that at face value, it takes away Alandria's choice to pursue somebody who could actually be interested in her. It takes away Taylor's choice to pursue somebody, and it affects Ace, who knows of this and allegedly can't say of anything, right? This is where I can tell Ace's age, and maybe that he doesn't listen to his management team if they did advise him on this interview. You saying this makes you look bad. Because why didn't you tell her, right? Because we're not in reality TV, because we don't have direct experiences with production. We don't know what that means. And you can't say explicitly because of your contract what that means, that outside influences or your conscious, which, okay, I can pick up on the fact that that's about production, but we don't know what that looks like. And because we don't know what that looks like or what kind of power is actually there, a lot of people are just going to say, I wouldn't have done that, and treat it as if it was a situation. People will be inclined, because we are humans, to compare that to a situation that we have encountered in our lives, and it more than likely is not. Like, unless you have been on reality TV and had a toxic experience with producers, not a good experience, like not like you worked with production and you had a great time with them, but unless you've experienced toxic production, I don't know that you can speak to the actual capacity to which production is willing to use their power in that situation. Then we move on to the fact that this adds, unfortunately, to the narrative that Alandria was not desired by Taylor. And then 3 minutes from now, he implies that Nick is faking the relationship. So this is adding to the misogynoir and the racist narrative that dark-skinned Black women are not attractive. Like, and the thing that's so unfortunate, and like I said about nuanced opinions, I don't believe that Ace thinks that at all. I don't think that Ace would intentionally want to be making that comment. I think that Ace does think Alandria is desirable, thinks Shelley's desirable. I think he thinks that dark-skinned Black women are desirable. In fact, I think dark-skinned Black women are his preference. I truly think all of those things. And again, at the same time, I want to tread lightly, but unfortunately, it's the impact over his intention of that conversation. And what this does is, I feel like this conversation is triggering for a lot of dark skinned Black women, because they see where this conversation is going to be implied to. And again, unfortunately, this will do nothing but add negativity to Alandria, and people to say, how didn't she know? Or question, did she know? And did producers tell her? Or question, even more so, oh, okay, he was never interested in her at all. How could she not pick up on the signs? Or to go from he was interested, but then found a stronger connection with Clark, to saying, oh, he was never interested in all. All of it is hurtful things that impact Elandria. All of it. All of it. So while, yes, he just revealed that allegedly producers are telling people who to pursue, and that's very sinister and very concerning for very many reasons about them actually having their own choices in there, it also does a lot of damage. Like, it also does a lot of damage. There will also be people who will think there's no way Ace kept that a secret to himself. He had to have told Shelley, and then for Shelley to support the relationship with Taylor. It's just Ace disclosing this information just had a lot of dominoes fall when they didn't have to, right? Moving along. In the next conversation they have, Ace talks about how he really couldn't understand why Huda kept her daughter a secret, and why it wasn't something that she started with in conversations. Just very matter of fact, I have a daughter, I'm a mom. It's just not something that he could ever understand. And then we go to him talking again about producer involvement. And again, this is an important moment because he talks about how he was forced to stand behind Huda. And some people are saying, okay, Ace was forced to stand behind Huda, but that doesn't mean that everybody else didn't choose to stand behind Huda. Or some people are saying, I don't believe that Ace was really forced to stand behind Huda. I think that he did that for Taylor because Taylor didn't want to be in competition with Jalen. I think that at times, and I hope this doesn't sound rude, this is coming from a chronic overthinker. I think at times people need to give their brains permission to do less work. Sometimes, unless you actually have inside information because you were there, why correct someone's story? Sometimes the energy, and this is why I'm really excited to be done with this season, the amount of energy. I love to analyze the parallels between reality TV and society. But the energy to not take things at face value and just use our brains to like try to find something else to which we really don't have an answer for, it's just not something I'm going to do. And it's not something I'm going to try to do in my content. So if that's something that you love, you do that, but that's not how I'm going to live my life. I have discernment. I trust my discernment. I think that I'm very intelligent. And simultaneously, there's so much more going on than for me to debate all of those things. If Ace was told to stand behind Huda, I think others were told to stand behind Huda. Why? Because I think that the Islanders were fucking tired of her. I think they were drained. And I think that if they actually could have gotten rid of her, I think they would have. I don't think producers were going to allow that for a second. And before you get your Cheeto dust fucking fingers out and start typing about how Hedda was a star of the show. For you. Okay? I think the show would have been much better had she gone home exactly at that time. In fact, I think the show would have been better if she wasn't cast on the show. And I think the show would have been better if she was a bombshell and if she came in only at Casa, which I've said since the beginning. While I'm here, let me acknowledge the nuance of that statement. I acknowledge the fact that Huda is Middle Eastern. Specifically, she's a Palestinian woman, and she made it to the finals of Love Island USA. And I don't recall a season where last season, but very recently, has there been representation for Middle Eastern women on reality television? So I want to acknowledge that. And yet simultaneously, the behavior that Huda had on screen, the behavior that was supported by fans, and the amount of people who tuned in just because they saw a clip of that behavior and resonated with it, and the way that she used her fan base and the way that she used her privilege in that villa against the Black women, against the Black people in general. It was very gross to watch. So anyways, I think that Ace stood behind Huda because he was forced to, as he implies in this interview, and that when he decided to not grab her hand, when she tried to grab his hand and looked very thankful, that it was because he wanted her to know, this is not for you. I actually don't have any say in this. And I don't want you to get the wrong idea. But a couple of quotes that he said is, you can stand on business at certain things. There's a big hand on the steering wheel. And if I had my way, I definitely would have picked Jalen to stay. It's very obvious what he's talking about, while all the while not being outright. He also talks about how influences try to talk you out of your feelings. And he talks about how there's a lot more deliberation that goes into picking an islander to go home than what we're shown. Taylor got on live and briefly reacted to this, but he does talk about the deliberation for Jeremiah to go home and all but implies that he went home because Taylor peeped how Jeremiah was moving with Andreina. And to quote Ace, he definitely wanted to get to know Andreina, and I'll leave that there. Well, my mind can go a lot of places from there, and I'm now inclined to think that he wanted Andreina to go home because he wanted to talk to her. Now, what Taylor says on his live is that he never once had a conversation with her after Jeremiah went home. So don't tell a lie on him. The two of them can sort that out. The two of them can sort that out. Ace goes on to talk about how he feels like not everybody had his back, especially not everyone had his back who he knew stuff about before and after the villa. So he's not the type of person who would just outright come out with their information. But if they're going to try to take him down, then they're coming down as well, essentially, is what he said. When asked if Nick had ever expressed to Ace that he wants to be with Elandria, he said that no, Nick had never expressed that. And he said that he was happy for Elandria. When getting out, were you happy to see all the news about Nick Elandria? And he says, I'm happy for Elandria. And it's at this point, again, where, like I said, it's every few conversations where we're back to going downhill. The next part that I want to talk about is when he talks about how, to quote him, Elandria and Shelley held themselves up to be the queens that they are. I feel like a lot of Black people on the show had to be therapists to answer the question if Elandria and Shelley are bullies. No bullying, none of that. I really enjoyed his answer here. And that's where I said, at times, the things that he says are so profound and so important to add to the conversation. And I really appreciate just how highly he talks of Elandria, how highly he talks about Shelley. I truly believe that he thinks that they are both queens. I also absolutely agree that a lot of the Black people on the show had to be therapists. In fact, I think pretty much every one of them did. Taylor had to listen to Huda's bullshit. Elandria had to listen to Huda's bullshit. Shelley had to listen to her bullshit. Ace also talked about how there was a lot of consistency in general for the Black people on the show, but the Black couples throughout this process. Again, another moment that I thought was important. None of us are there. None of us are in this process, but how they were being treated, how they were being edited. He felt like there was a lot of consistency. And I agree because we've saw a picture of production now. I saw a lot of white faces. At 59 minutes into the episode, Ace is asked who his friends are now, and he lists Elandria, Taylor, Shelley, Jeremiah, and not sometimes Brian, but Brian sometimes checks in on him. Notably, Nick's name is missing, and he doesn't respect him not being his friend in public. We don't know really what that means. He says something about Nick's PR answer. I believe that's in regards to at the Watch What Happens Live when he was asked, do you think that everybody here should have been in the Final Four? And Nick and Elandria answered yes. And on one hand, yes, I get it. That's your friend. On another hand, a simple text to be like, hey, that was douchey. I thought you were going to say me. And your friend is saying, well, me and Elandria are taking a lot of heat right now. So our PR, our marketing told us to answer and keep things cute and cordial and not try to like shake the table. That would be enough. That would be enough to move past it. However, because there's not enough information here between their fallout, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. I hate how Ace talks about how the last Nick expressed to him was that he was physically attracted to Elandria. I don't know why his last conversation with Nick inside of that villa is relevant if he hasn't talked to him in the last couple months. Now, after the fact, Speedy posts a video, and I'll tell you where I went. The video basically said everybody's chirping and everybody has their thoughts, but only Ace knows stuff. And if you knew what I was told off camera, you would have thoughts too. In my mind, goes a lot of places there. So I think that if Ace's issue with Nick is that he thinks that Nick is using Alandria, that's a completely different issue than what's been said out loud. And we've heard Alandria talk about how Nick is protecting her and allowing her to turn her mind off. And even to throw that in the wind at their relationship, I just don't understand it. I just don't understand it. When he was outright asked, do you think that the relationship with Nick and Alandria is real? He doesn't answer at all, but just looks at the camera. And Speedy says, is that your answer? And he said yes. Also, I just feel like even that thought of his lacks a lot of nuance, because how are you going to talk about how the last time you talked, like they had not felt a romantic spark yet? Like, okay, it's been almost 2 months now. Like, don't you want to see if the relationship progressed? Like, don't you want to see if the relationship changed? Now, I do want to say this because, again, there's layers. If what Ace is wanting from Nick is to speak out in regards to his character, whether there was a segment of the reunion that we missed or whether there was a conversation that we didn't hear the full extent to, if his character was being questioned and he wanted Nick to speak up for his character at the reunion, because the reunion is the time and place to address issues, grievances, and get everything all out in the open. Well, I recognize that Nick has been positive towards Ace in his interviews. I understand why Ace would be hurt that his friend doesn't speak up. Even more so, I understand why Ace, a black man who has been vilified on TV and comes out and then feels like his character is being even further misrepresented, why he would want his white friend, or why his white friend should, let me rephrase, use his privilege to say that's actually not his character at all. Like, I'm great friends with him. And it's not about like, why should Nick should want to do that if he's a friend to Ace. Like, and what Ace says is that when he said to Nick, I don't respect you, only support being a friend to me in private, but not, or in public, but not about these small things. I don't know what the wording was, but I don't appreciate you not being a good friend to me. Okay. Nick basically said that he was over all of it. He was over all of it. And like I said, that would be dismissive. Just to add a layer of nuance in, that's dismissive. Does that mean that that shouldn't have been talked about privately between the two of them? No. It's very confusing as to why. And I noticed that when Nick said in whichever interview that Ace won't even hang out with us, I knew that there was a problem. Okay. But yeah, how are you going to jump around at Disney World in the background of a kiss with Nick and Alandria and then go on a podcast? There's lots of different thought processes around. And I say it could be any of that. It could be all of that. It could be a combination of it all. There's a world where there's multiple things that could be true at once. In regards to ending with this, on top of all of the negativity that he would bring towards Alandria, towards their relationship from this, I really think that he thought he was going to shake the table with this episode and make everybody question their relationship. And in reality, he really just kicked the leg a little, like because at the end of the day, as I said earlier in the episode about him and Shelly's relationship, even if they had been scamming us since the beginning because they had known each other, I don't care. I don't care. Okay. So to end with this about Shelly's involvement, this puts her in a hell of a position. It seems to me, didn't think out the negativity this would send towards Alandria. It seems to me he didn't think about some of the underlying messages that this could be reiterating. And it seems to me like it didn't occur to him the position that now this puts Shelley in. Because even though their experience and what's going on within their friendship may be totally different than what we're seeing, there's a perception now that Shelley's dating somebody who bashed Elandria and her relationship in public. And the question is going to be, whose side are you on? That's how people are going to be feeling. And to that, I just want to say, I'm not going to be echoing that sentiments. I am rooting for Shelley and I am rooting for Elandria. There's no other cast member on this season who has faced more hate and outright racism and negativity and even piling on from big brands and major publications the way that Elandria and Shelley have faced this season. And from the very beginning, they have been hyper scrutinized and called mean girls, and every step of their experience was honed in on. And for me personally, I'm not going to scrutinize their friendship because I believe that these are both two intelligent women. I believe these are both two women who have the ability to have great discernment. I believe that they know more about what their situation is than I do. And I believe that they can pick better for themselves than I could. I believe that they can trust themselves in their own judgment. So if they're friends, they're friends. There's something that I don't know. There's something that we don't know. There's stuff that we may not be seeing. I don't see any other friendships on the cast, not Hannah and Iris, whom dated the same guy for a brief amount of time, not Amaya and Huda, whom we're hearing trickles of. That friendship is just for the perks of support from stan bases, but we're just not seeing the scrutiny of friendships the way that we're seeing the scrutiny of Shelley and Elandria's friendships. And most importantly, as a white woman, I've made it a priority with my content to never add to or embolden people to think that this is a safe space to punch down on Black women, to add negativity towards Black women. Like this just isn't the place for that. There's tons of podcasts who talk about it, but I personally don't think it's appropriate. As I said, I can notice things, I can talk about them, but as far as just having like these deep feelings where I just pick one over the other, pick one woman over the other, I'm not going to do that with my content. You won't see it here. And I don't want to embolden non-Black people in my comments to think this is a safe space to add on, because you give an inch, you take a mile. What else did I want to talk about? I talked about Chris's podcast. I talked about Speedy's. The episode of Modern Love that Nick and Elandria went on was absolutely beautiful. And I watched that right after the episode that I listened to with Ace. And when she said on Modern Love that what's most draining is having to defend her and Nick's relationship, Ace, you are a part of that. You are a part of that, unfortunately. Any other thoughts to wrap up this season? I'm preparing to not talk about it anymore. Let's go through my phone, make sure there's nothing else that I want to say. Pepe's a loser, both for hanging out with Marco, for chatting with TMZ, notoriously a brand that you have to call on yourself, which we know that he did. For thinking that he's living life in the limelight when he's not, for wearing the former logo for Cleveland Major League Baseball team when he's not even from Ohio, much less the logo has now not been used because it's racist. Like, Pepe is just weird all across the board. Okay. Anything else? Iris is brunette because she doesn't want Pepe to even look in her direction. And to that, I say yes. It looks like Nick is in Houston, probably with Elandria. And the most recent episode of Beyond the Villa was Peacock, you're not beating the allegations. You're not beating the allegations. I hate you. I hate you. But that's pretty much everything I have to say about the season. Pretty much everything that I thought initially, I ended up being right on at the end of the season. Shout out to everybody who's listened all season. Me and my friends have a running joke that it's been day zero Nicolandrians. I've been a day zero before the season. Myself and my friend Nikki went through and picked people who we thought would be together, and both of us put Nick and Alandria together day one before anything even happened, even the first episode. Yeah. So that part of it has been really satisfying. But yeah, there's just been so much of this season that I'm ready to let it go. Let it go, let it grow. And I do think, in all seriousness, there was one part of Ace's episode is going to bust some things open for Love Island. As somebody who's very interested in production, he said a lot of things that are just not okay. Not okay, probably illegal, especially if they're true. And there's probably going to be some sort of investigation into there. And I know I'm not the only creator who thinks that. I'm going to be coming with some really exciting episodes. And I want to say this, it's a white show. It's kind of painful some seasons. But if you've never watched the show Welcome to Plathville, I'm going to need you to watch it and lock in, because it's going to be something that I'm going to start to talk about. And I have a very exciting interview scheduled with. Everybody, thank you for joining me this holiday weekend. I'm taking a little bit of a vacation. It's been a season, it's been a lot. If you need something to watch, I've been watching the show The Institute on Amazon Prime. It's a scripted show. Take a break from reality TV. It's absolutely phenomenal. 10 out of 10. I've been enjoying Welcome to Plathville. I watched 7 seasons in the course of 1 week, and I'm currently watching a Brazilian show called The 3%, which is on Netflix, and I'm also obsessed with Also Scripted. Hate Johnny Depp, hate, double hate, loathe entirely, but I never saw Pirates of the Caribbean as a child, and I also did watch that last evening. If you're watching something fascinating in the comments, put it. If you have some encouragement, if you just have something that you want to say after a long season of Love Island USA season 7, put it in the comments, make sure to rate the podcast 5 stars if you're listening on Spotify. And I hope all of you have an amazing rest of your day and weekend.